Good evening, everybody.
Thank you for being here.
What a delight. Two neurosurgeons on stage. What could go wrong?
Exactly. All we need is an anesthesiologist to put everybody to sleep.
I just want to say, I know there's a big presidential debate tonight. Many of you may be scooting out for that. But to be fair, I think this is going to be better for your brain health overall, being right here with us. Do you agree?
I do agree. Before we begin, I really want to make a comment, which is just to say something to Sanjay. I am so grateful that you're here and you took the time to be here. And I just want to recognize, I don't know if there are physicians in the audience, but you have really become like the Edward R. Murrow of medical reporting. You know, I've watched so many of your pieces and listened to your podcast, and you always stay true to the science. You know, and I think that's what's great about you, is that it's not about you being on stage in front of the camera. Everything you say is supported by real scientific literature. And I admire that you've done that, and just kudos to you for that.
Thank you very much. That means a lot, and I appreciate that. But we get to talk about gray matters today.
All right, let's do it.
I'm very excited about. I want to set the stage for a second. By the way, I just want to call out a few people. And you should do this. I just got to tell you, your wife and your two sons are here. Don't forget to thank them.
They are. I take them for granted.
You take them for granted.
Yeah.
They're lovely. We got a chance to spend some time backstage. Also, Jeff Zucker is here. I just got to shout him out because he is a legendary media figure and someone who is near and dear to both Dr. Schwartz and I. So if you're here still, Jeff, thank you for being here. I want to set the stage a little bit because we're going to talk a lot about neurosurgery, but a few things that maybe you don't know. There's about 4,000 neurosurgeons in the country. And they staff about 6,000 hospitals. It's a 7-year training program in neurosurgery, so that's after medical school. So most people don't really start their professional career until they're some point in their 30s. So they have this sort of prolonged adolescence of sorts, albeit a pretty intense one. The sacrifices are considerable, but as you're about to hear, the rewards are pretty significant as well. They're enormous. And that's a lot of what you write about in the book. Why don't we start there? Why did you decide to write this?
You know, I felt that the public really didn't know a lot about what brain surgeons do. You know, there's a lot of myths about brain surgery, that it's really hard.
Is that a myth?
Well, there's part of it that's myth, and I wanted to really understand where that came from. Like, where does the myth come from that brain surgery is supposed to be so hard? And it really comes back to Harvey Cushing, and we can talk about that. But there were so many stories that are in our field that we know very well about famous neurosurgeons that have been influential on us, famous people who've had brain surgery, what it's like to really do what we do, you know, and to make those decisions in the operating room where, you know, someone's future is really in your hands and you're responsible for their future day in and day out, you know, over a course of an entire career where you really get no break. And to put that in a way that the general public could really absorb and not be intimidated by the subject. And so the book just poured out of me. I mean, I wrote it in the course of a year. I started it in January and I finished in December in 2021. And it was really a passion project. And it was just so much fun because I was not only telling stories that I've always wanted to tell and put down in words and talking about myself a little bit, but also researching things that I really didn't know that much about that I wanted to learn more about.
Why did you decide to become a neurosurgeon? And let me preface it with this, sort of bouncing on something you just said, that John F. Kennedy once said, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And I think what he was saying is that some of the joy is in the challenge. The challenge is the joy. Was that the case for you?
Yeah, I was a kid who played instruments, for example. I was a musician. And I loved to try to take a piece of music that was thought to be very challenging and focus on trying to learn how to do it. And I'm not saying I could play it perfectly at that period of time, but I love to sit in my room by myself and just go over it again and again and again. And there's that sort of focus that's required. I was also very interested in astronomy, and I wanted to be an astronaut. And I thought, how cool! I love studying, you know, the universe and space-time, and I thought it'd be amazing to be an astronaut, to use computers and technology to travel to a place and see things that no one gets to see. And the first time I saw a brain surgeon operating under a microscope, I actually had a camera taking a picture of it. I was a resident at the time, and I saw this person who is sitting in the cockpit of a chair with their arm being suspended to reduce their tremor, looking into a microscope, and they were traveling into this realm that nobody gets to go to. And I was in awe of that and really astonished by that. And I thought, this can fulfill my childhood dream of being an astronaut, and I can also help people, which is a whole other aspect to it. So that's what drove me to it.
So you're either going to be a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon.
It was one or the other. It was one or the other. Yeah,
Okay,
I was the black sheep of the family. My brother is out here as well, Ralph, he'll tell you.
Was he the black sheep of the family?
Yeah, he's the overachiever.
Does this, by the way, you're mentioning this chair that you're sitting in, and you have a chair that is actually designed to reduce tremor. Most people probably never have been inside the operating room. Can you just describe this a little bit, including the chair and just how you situate yourself?
Yeah, I mean, because we're working in a realm, we deal with the world around us on the order of, inches and centimeters. We grab things, they're sort of this big, this big. And when you're working in the world of neurosurgery, you're really living in the realm of millimeters, and sometimes even less than millimeters. And so that's not a area that we're comfortable existing in. And so you have to use these microscopes that magnify everything, or endoscopes where you can literally put the lens, very, very close to where you're operating. And everybody has a little bit of a tremor. I remember when I first decided, I thought maybe I'd be a neurosurgeon. I remember I was sort of reading a newspaper, and I looked at the corner of the newspaper and I could see it wiggling a little bit. And I was like, oh my, I have a tremor. How am I going to do this job? What am I going to do to learn how to reduce my tremor? And you learn how to do that. It's a skill, and we have different techniques that we do. So when I'm under the microscope and I'm making very delicate moves, just before I'm about to do them, I'll actually hold my breath, and I realize that I'm doing it. And then you learn how to brace your pinky or your hand or even the instrument. I'll try to, actually the scissors that I'm about to cut with, I'll try to brace the scissors on the edge of the skull to make sure that it is absolutely not moving, because we all have a physiologic tremor. It's just everybody has it. And you have to find ways to reduce it during the operation. And what's terrifying is when something goes wrong in a surgery, like you're operating on an aneurysm and the aneurysm ruptures, and you realize that you have to get control over this. And what happens is your heart rate will suddenly go from 60 beats a minute to 160 beats per minute. And that will exacerbate your tremor, because if your heart rate goes up, you start to tremble. And you realize if you're trembling, you can no longer do what you need to do. You physically can't do it. And so you have to calm yourself, at that moment and try to focus yourself to get back into the moment in order to perform that task. And I think I was very taken by that aspect of neurosurgery, the physicality of it, the microscopic nature of it, the voyaging into a place that people don't get to go to. The technical aspect really appealed to me.
I got to say, it's really interesting talking to you, Ted, because we're both neurosurgeons, and even a conversation like this is often a conversation that is not had. We go through our training, and it's very didactic, it's very procedural, but to just even this little newspaper story you're talking about and your own sort of insecurities around that, we don't actually have those conversations a lot. So
I remember I would try to eat Chinese food with chopsticks in my left hand. For literally a year, I was like, I'm only going to eat with my left hand to try to make my left hand as good as my right hand.
I would stay up late and go to the lab because, it's funny, I was worried that I wasn't technically good enough. I thought I was okay, but I knew that I would watch some people in the operating room and they were virtuosos. They just, no movement was wasted. And for me, I needed to practice a lot. So I'd go to the lab and I'd sew skin grafts onto rats and things like that, and just do it with my left hand and my right hand and do all that.
There are some surgeons who literally in their office, even full attendings who have been practicing, I've gone to their offices and they will have suture kits with a microscope where they literally just come back to their office and continue to practice microscopic anastomoses, because it's such a critical skill to learn how to do, and it's not intuitive. But anyone can learn how to do it, although I'm sure you've had this experience. Every once in a while we'll train a resident who will come through, and you don't operate with them under the microscope. They may be a 4th, 5th year resident. They could be in their late 20s.
Right.
And you sort of say, all right, I want you to do a little part of this operation. And they'll go under the microscope and you'll suddenly see their hands flailing about. And you'll think, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with this person?
And what do you do? Because at this point, just to set the stage, they've gone to college. They've gone to medical school. 8 years there. and now maybe 5 years or so, you're saying, into their residency. So you're, 12, 13 years
29,
into
30 years old.
And for the first time, under the microscope, you're seeing their hands, and instead of being perfectly still,
Right.
throwing a suture.
Well, you try to give them all those techniques. It's funny, I'm seeing my kids here. I remember playing anatomy. What was the game?
Operation?
Operation with my kids. And they would try to, pull the funny bone out. And, their hands would be all over the place. And I'd be like, no, you got to rest your arm against the operation if you want to not make it buzz,
Is this true, Ben? Did he do that?
So, the same thing with the resident, right? You give them skills. You sort of say, look, this is what you need to do. This is how you reduce your tremor, and you hope that they get it. Obviously, there are, as you know, there's some surgeons who do very technically demanding neurosurgical operations, and there's some who don't, right? There's some who do more straightforward things, some of the more easy operations. They have partners that they may refer the more difficult things to. Not everyone becomes a skull-base surgeon or an aneurysm surgeon. And you kind of go where you're supposed to be in order to get good outcomes.
At what point did you know that you were good enough for this?
I'll let you know.
You are regarded, not because you're a humble guy, but you are regarded as one of the foremost skull-base surgeons in the country. And these are challenging operations.
I'll tell you, I do not feel that way a single day that I wake up. I always feel that I'm still trying to get better. I still feel like I'm not good enough. I still come home, trying to figure out how to make operations better and sort of kicking myself if things don't go perfectly. And I actually wrote a paper recently where I looked at my results over 1,000 of a particular operation that I did. And I looked at the last 150 I did with the first 100, and I was getting better at every stage. Like even after I'd done 750 of this particular operation, the next 150 were a little better than the prior 150. And I think we do continue to get better and better and better, because it's not just the technical, it's also the judgment, right? We're making so many decisions during our operations, and each one of those decisions is so critical. How hard do I pull? What can I get away with? Can this vein come off? Can this nerve come off? Where do I need to make the cut with the scissors to save the nerve and not damage it? And all of those decisions you make, unfortunately, because sometimes you don't do it right, previously, and then you do it better the next time.
Right.
So, and neurosurgery is a very humbling profession because, and that's one of the things I try to write about a little bit, is that on the one hand, you do have to have a certain amount of arrogance, right? Like, you have to convince your patient that you're the best person to do this particular operation, and you're going to do a good job, and you're going to give your all for it. But you also have to have an enormous amount of humility at the same time, because you know that at any given moment, something could go sideways. And you have to know to never lose your vigilance, right? You have to always be completely focused, because you have to deal with the burden of that when things don't go well, which is, horrible and such a weight on us.
How much does that plague you? I remember when I was a resident once, I was in training still at the time, but I remember taking care of a patient where things did not go well. It was a very, very challenging outcome. And I remember going to my chairman and saying, I don't know that I'm cut out for this, because it affected me so deeply psychologically. Have you had that experience?
I've definitely had experiences where I've been despondent. I mean, I've had patients where I've gone into the family's arms and cried hysterically, and just sort of said, I'm sorry, I failed you, I'm sorry. Is
it difficult to talk about now?
It's always difficult to talk about. I mean, we carry those patients with us. I carry them with me always. I remember all of them. And that's always still very hard. I read a book by one of your co-residents. You wrote the introduction to it, Jody
Stern.
Stern, right?
Yeah.
And he writes about, and it was such a good book, emotional armor and emotional flexibility, right? And I think that's very true, because at the one hand, you have to have emotional armor to deal with when things don't go perfectly. Because, even after a case that may not go perfectly, you have another patient that afternoon, you have a second operation, you have another operation the next day. Like, how are you going to recover from that? You need to be there for the next patient. So you have to be able to erect emotional armor and move on. On the other hand, you can't be a robot, right? And we're not. And you can't have that armor up all the time. It's very unhealthy. So you have to have the flexibility to let it down, and feel and show the patients what you're feeling and be a sensitive physician. And I think that sort of flexibility is one of the biggest challenges of doing complex neurosurgery where you have to perform at one moment and then you have to let it down at another moment. And I think that's very challenging. It was a great book.
Well, yeah, he wrote a great book. But you talk about this in Gray Matters as well, and I think there's broad relevance here, even for people outside of neurosurgery, even outside of medicine. This idea of the emotional armor and yet the need to not be a robot at the same time. One of the questions I get a lot, and you probably get it as well, friends of mine, colleagues will say, I'm hoping you can refer me to the best person for X, the best neurosurgeon for a spine operation, or the best orthopedic for a shoulder, whatever it might be. How do you handle that?
Yeah.
Because it's funny, even as colleagues in my institution, when I'm operating with my residents, my medical students. I don't really operate with other attendings, so I don't really know how to evaluate their overall technical skills or anything else. I know them as human beings, but not necessarily what they're like in the operating room. Someone comes to Dr. Schwartz, I need the best guy for X.
Yeah.
As a doctor, how do you handle it?
The first thing I try to tell people is there is no such thing as a best, right? It doesn't exist. There are a lot of really good surgeons at what you have, and you want to find someone who specializes in that, who does mostly that. And you could get maybe 2, maybe 3 opinions max. In New York, people, they go all over. They get a ton of opinions. And trust your gut, but make sure you're seeing one of the top people, of which there is a group of them, and go with the one whose personality you like. But I very much try to get people off the idea that there is such a thing as a best. And you're right, we never know how good other surgeons are. We go to M&M conference, which is where we discuss complications every week. So we sort of see our partners' results, constantly. So we have a sense of that. But we're never in the operating room, and we never have like a surgical coach. People have talked about that, someone who watches you operate and sort of evaluates you and says, you could do this better, you could do that better. It doesn't exist in surgery. When that operating room door closes, you are on your own. There is nobody coming in there. There's nobody evaluating you. You can essentially do whatever you want. You're only beholden to yourself and your patient, which is so unique in terms of sort of skills that we do and being evaluated for them.
If you weren't a neurosurgeon, what would you be doing?
So I was very passionate about music. That was my alternative career. I loved being a bass player. I went to Eastman School of Music and Berklee College of Music, and I considered becoming a musician during college, and that's why I spent a summer at Berklee and said, hey, what would my life be like if I were just doing music? And it was great, and I loved creating music and performing music, but it just, to me, was a little bit selfish. Like, it was about being on stage and getting adulation and sort of, I didn't feel like I was helping the world in the way that I really wanted to.
People come to you, I'm sure, like they do to me. Would you advise or recommend your own children go into medicine or even neurosurgery? Medicine's changed a lot since you first went to medical school. What would you say?
If you're passionate about being a doctor, and really what it comes down to is caring for other people. I mean, at its very basics, even though brain surgery is very technical and there's a whole technical aspect of it, you're still a caregiver, right? You still have to really want to give your time to help another human being in need. That has to charge you up. You have to love doing that. If you're that person and you love doing that and you love taking care of people, more than other things like, your free time or maybe your salary, then absolutely you should do it. It's an incredible profession. I mean, I think I love what I do, and you still do it, by the way. You don't have to operate, right? But you do. So why do you still go into the operating room?
No, I think it's the same reason. I get a lot of satisfaction out of caring for patients, and I think that there's no other relationship in society like the physician-patient relationship. I mean, it's interesting. I think some of the most intense relationships in my life outside of my family are probably with my patients, because you're forced to have this intensity to the relationship.
I write about it in the prologue, and it happens so commonly where you sort of walk into the family waiting room at the end of the operation, and you're meeting a family that maybe you've met the spouse, the husband, the wife, the kids. Maybe they came to the pre-op visit. Maybe they didn't. Maybe you just met them before the surgery. You barely know them. And you can see the anticipation when you're walking out, because they don't know if you're coming out and saying, oh, I'm sorry, things didn't go well, or things went great. And when you come out and say, everything went great, we got the whole tumor out, and your husband, your wife, they're going to be fine. you just see the relief in their bodies, you know, and it's palpable. And then so commonly, they will literally just say, can I give you a hug? Or they'll just reach out and give you a hug at that moment. And it's this person you don't even know. And I'm like, yes, like I love that hug. You know, when that happens, like to me, that's the payoff of neurosurgery. And I'll often have students with me, you know, over the summer, whether they're college students or high school students or medical students, and I'll have them come with me into the waiting room. And often they'll be there for that moment and they'll see it. And I'll be like, did you see that? Like, that's what it's all about.
When you're training residents and medical students, and you sort of alluded to this with the microscope, but again, I think there's a broader relevance here to sort of know, is someone ready to take the next step? Because without exaggeration, people's lives are on the line. When you're ready to hand over the scalpel to somebody, hand over the needle driver, whatever it might be, how do you sort of evaluate that?
You know, you raise a great point, which is that society at large wants, they don't want residents practicing on them, right? They'll tell you that. In fact, I'll get so many patients who will say to me, you'll do my whole operation, right?
Right.
And the truth is, I will do everything that's important in your operation, 100%. I am there doing it for you because it's in my best interest that you have the best outcome possible. On the other hand, as soon as you graduate from a neurosurgery residency program and you go out into the world, you're expected to be able to perform neurosurgery. So the society wants neurosurgeons to come the day they leave the program to be fully trained and ready to do everything. And yet they don't want them to do anything during the training program. Right. And obviously those two things are mutually exclusive. You can't have it both ways. And so you have to give them graduated responsibility. But there are certain things that I will never let a resident do, ever. And they're the things where I know that if they make a mistake, I can't fix it. Like there's some things you can't fix. And so I try to take them to those points so they get there and then show them exactly what I'm doing. But I know, and I know it was for me the same way, there are certain things that I never did until I was the one responsible for it. And you know, they were my patient, and it was essentially the first time I was doing that particular thing, whether it's peeling the last bit of an acoustic neuroma off the facial nerve, and if you're a little too aggressive, they're going to be paralyzed in the face forever, and they're going to be walking around saying, "Oh yeah, Dr. Gupta operated on me. You know, how was your surgery? It was great." Yeah, like that's our business card, right? That guy walking around like this. So you can't let that happen, and so you know.
Should we be laughing at that?
Sorry, medical humor is morbid, but we get
gallows humor in the operating room.
I know. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Okay.
But that's the truth, and I often think about that. Like, you know, it's very hard to train neurosurgeons for that reason.
You know, it's funny. I totally relate. I remember I was done with my training, and I was seeing patients on my own now. And one of the first patients I saw had a brain tumor, needed this brain tumor out. And talking them through the whole thing in the consultation room, and a great relationship. And as I'm walking out the room, literally the door was almost shut. Doctor, I got one more question. I said, what's that? How many times have you done this before? You know what I said? I said, you wouldn't believe how many times I've done this before. Shut the door.
Right. Yeah.
Got away with it.
Yeah.
The patient did well.
Yeah, I slept in a Motel 8 last night.
Right. Holiday Inn Express.
Holiday Inn Express, sorry.
Holiday Inn Express. Have you had a most, call it harrowing operation? I mean, an operation that has never left you?
There are many. You know, there's one in particular, which is, there was a period of time, and just to sort of rewind, when I trained in neurosurgery, if you were operating deep into the brain in areas we call like the third ventricle and taking out craniopharyngiomas, which are these tumors that are just sort of ensconced deep in the brain, the way to take it out was to make a big incision like this and to take down all the bone to the side of the face.
Yeah, and as you're describing this, because again, most people have never seen this before.
Yeah.
So as much as you can, and I'm happy to help out, but just like in the operating room, so patient is on the table, obviously asleep.
Right.
To immobilize the head.
We literally pin the head with these, they're literally incredibly sharp pins, right? There's two on one side, one on the other, so the head is turned, and we're pinning them because the head cannot move during the operation.
It's pins, and then that frame.
And by the way, you put like 60 to 80 pounds of pressure.
Right.
And you're literally like ratcheting it and
Patient's
screwing
asleep,
it.
by the way.
They're asleep. You don't feel anything. And so then it's incredibly important, by the way, how do you position your patient? Like what position do you put the head in? We spend a long time thinking about and figuring out what position to put the head in, because what I say to the residents is, when you want to win a marathon, your first mile is really important, and it's going to set up the whole rest of the race. And if the patient is not positioned in exactly the right position from the beginning, you're going to face problems later on down the road when you're trying to see something that's very difficult to see. And so I'm always there, every case, putting the patient in exactly the right position. Patients are asleep. We have to get into the skull. And we talk about the microsurgery, but getting in and out of the skull is like carpentry. Like the skull is very, very thick. The scalp is very, very bloody. So we have to shave a bit of the hair, and we have to take a knife and open up the scalp, and then we have to literally pull the scalp down to expose the skull. And then we drill holes in the skull to remove a piece. Sorry for grossing anybody out. I apologize. But the point is, once you get to that point, you get to the dura, which is the covering of the brain, and you carefully open that up, and then you're looking at the brain, which, by the way, is incredible. It's an awesome, every time I expose the brain, there's like a gasp of, oh my goodness, this is incredible.
After 30 years.
After 30 years, I love it.
And you see this brain, and it's pulsating.
It's pulsating,
It's
pink.
incredible. It's alive, and it's alive. But to see the brain and to realize that every thought, every joy, every love, every memory, everything is there.
It's the ultimate responsibility. It's like someone is handing you
of the most enigmatic.
They're handing you their most prized possession,
right,
basically, and saying, will you take care of this? This is the most valuable thing that I own. I'm giving it to you for 4 hours.
And you still, as I do, I'm sure, think about this every time you do an operation.
Every time. So this sort of dismantling of the head, and then you have to essentially move the brain out of the way by retracting it, which you want to do very, very gently, because you have to displace it to get underneath the brain. And it could take you an hour and a half just to even see the tumor, in the beginning. And so very early in my career, I started to be one of the early adopters and first people to start doing a surgery where we would just go up through the nostrils with an endoscope, which is a long, thin telescope. So we wouldn't make any incisions.
Can we put up that slide? It would be the second slide, I think, in the deck. Let's just show this so we can,
Second slide, go to the next one.
Second slide, sorry.
So on the right is the way I learned how to do these operations, and my right, on the left is the way I taught myself and had to learn how to do in the middle of my training, and had to do for the first time on someone, before I really had done it many times before. And there was one person in particular who had a very big tumor deep in her brain. She was a very well-known designer whose vision was very important. She was losing her vision. She had the means to seek second, third, and fourth opinions, and she sought many opinions and got many different opinions from different high, chairmen of departments who all said, one said you need to open up the side of your head, one said we're going to, put a needle in there and we're going to put radioactive material into it because it's too dangerous to even take this tumor out. Another one said open up the head, and I said, you know what, I can take this out just by going through your nostrils without making any incisions whatsoever. We're going to put a scope up your nose and I can take it out. And at that moment in time, this was the biggest tumor I'd ever taken out. I wasn't 100% sure what would happen, but I had taken out tumors that were close to it and about that big, and it made sense for me to take it out this way. And she went to see back to another surgeon and said, well, Dr. Schwartz says he can take it out through my nose. Like, why are you opening up the side of my head? And he looked at her and he said, whatever you do, do not let Dr. Schwartz take that tumor out through your nose.
Wow.
And I was like 4 years into my career.
So the chairman of another department presumably is saying, absolutely not.
Yeah.
You're 4 years out of your training, and you're saying, I can do this.
I can do it.
So we'll get to this part, but that's the confidence / arrogance with the humility that the audience is getting to see with you already.
Yeah, and by the way, that chairman has since called me up and said, you were right.
Oh, well, that's unusual.
This is the way. This is a better way to do it. You taught me how to do this operation.
Wow.
And this, as you know, this is the way all tumors are done nowadays, right? But back then, nobody was doing it.
Right.
And it took that sort of vision and foresight and cojones, to say, like, I can do this. I can get it done. I know I can do it safely. It makes sense. It made logical sense. It just made so much more sense than coming in from the side to take a straight shot into the middle of the tumor. But I was terrified. And I was up all night the night before, and I was thinking about it. And what you do when you prepare for one of these surgeries, as you know, is you sort of imagine what you're going to see on the way in. And you run through every step. Like, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to see this, and I expect to see this, then I'm going to expect to see that. And you have to create a 3D reconstruction based on the two-dimensional images, which are the MRI scans. So you have to be able to take that 2D MRI scan and turn it into a 3D model so you know what you can see to make sure that you can get it done. And then you know where the landmines are going to be and where the tumor is going to be. And then when you get in there, you hope that's what you see, but sometimes it's not, right? So sometimes you get in there and what you see is like, uh-oh, like this isn't what I expected. So then you have to change your plan on the spot. And you have to say, all right, I can't go this way, I'm going to try to go this way, or I'm going to try to go this way. And we got the whole tumor out. You know, we cured her of her tumor. It has never come back. She's now retired, she's doing great, and I've since taken out another 150 craniopharyngiomas, which is a big number for a very rare tumor, and done 2,000 of those operations. And as you know, that's the way everybody in the world takes out pituitary tumors and craniopharyngiomas. And it was great, like within a lifetime, to feel like the needle moved, like you were involved. And I was not the first one to do it, but I was involved in moving the needle, which was great, and publishing papers on it, and teaching courses on it, and writing books about it. And so that was very fulfilling.
That's pretty cool, dude. Here,
thanks, man.
Bring it in.
Thanks, man.
That's amazing. No, really. I mean, yeah, please. And that slide there, everybody, if you can, just for a second, take your finger just right above your eyeball. Feel that space right underneath the bone, the orbital rim. You put that slide back up for a second. This is another approach that you take, and you write about this in the book. This is early on in the book. So you talked about transnasal, to get through the nose, to go to the base of the brain, and then transorbital.
Yeah, so I discovered that approach. I was invited to South Korea to speak at a meeting about endonasal surgery. And I literally flew to South Korea for like 6 hours. Like I flew in, I took a shower, I worked out, I took a shower, I went to the conference, came home. But in South Korea, all the neurosurgeons were doing transorbital surgery. They were making an incision in the eyelid, they were moving the eyeball aside, and using a corridor that I never knew existed in order to get to parts of the skull base that are incredibly hard to get to, that you can't get to through the nose. You can't. But you can get through a little incision in the eyelid. And I was blown away by what they were doing. And I was like, this is what we need to be doing. This is clearly a better approach. And luckily, I was involved in courses where we had cadavers that we could do dissections on, and we could practice, and I could work it out and figure out how to do it and read papers on it. And work with a collaborator and another surgeon who operates around the eye and say, hey, do you want to do this together? And so we started doing that approach, and now we're about to publish the first textbook of transorbital skull base surgery, which is coming out soon. So it was sort of another way, but it made it so much easier because I'd gone through it once before. So I didn't feel the same naysayers, and also people were less likely to say, hey, you can't do that, because they're like, well, he kind of did it before, so maybe he's onto something. So now we have a whole program doing that, but you have to select the cases very carefully. It's not for everybody.
And part of the way our field moves forward is that you do this, you write about it, you describe the techniques, you list your outcomes and patient series, and then we all become better because of it. That's how the scientific field sort of evolves. You write in the book a bit about AI, artificial intelligence. You also wrote an article about AI for the Boston Globe. As you know, I sit on the subcommittee for the National Academy on AI. It's all we talk about. For this audience, I'm wondering, hope or hype, how do you think about AI in medicine and specifically neurosurgery?
So I think it's a little bit of hope and a little bit of hype. I think the hope part is that we will be working alongside of AI, and there's some things that AIs do incredibly well. If you have to sift through a lot of information and make a decision based on that information, it could be a list of symptoms and tests to make a diagnosis. Or if you feed an AI 1 million mammograms and you tell them these are the ones that have breast cancer and these are the ones that don't, an AI will become really good at reading the mammograms, and they will not fall asleep, they won't spill their coffee on the mammogram. Like, they'll get it right more times than a human being will eventually if you train them well and you teach them well. And the same thing for looking at pathology slides, where you're looking at the slides and you teach them how to do it. That is different than performing brain surgery, because when you perform brain surgery, it's a physical task where you have to interact with the outside world in a very physical way. And I really feel that human beings have evolved to learn how to interact with the outside world. We evolved to find food and to build shelter and to learn how to, cook food and run away from predators and then, kill predators. And so all of those tasks, like, throwing a spear to hit something or throwing a rock to get your dinner, we evolved to do that incredibly well. And we're very good. We have a physical intuition about the world around us. We know that, how much this weighs and what's going to happen when I drop it. And if I look away, it's still going to be there. Robots and AIs didn't evolve that way. They didn't evolve on the planet Earth in order to survive. They were created, and they evolved basically in a box on somebody's desk. And they're still in the Garden of Eden, right? They still have their creator taking care of them. They're not, evolving on their own at the moment in the physical world. And so I think at the moment, human beings are just much better at performing intricate physical tasks where you have to make thousands and thousands of decisions, and each decision you make is going to alter the outside world in a particular way, and you have to react to that. So I think there's some things that AIs are going to do incredibly well. Now, if you have to, I use a robot in the operating room to place electrodes in the brain, where I need to put an electrode at a certain trajectory through the brain, and I'll go on a computer and I'll be able to see exactly where I want it to go and how to get it there, and I can use a robotic arm to put me right in that place. So there's some tasks that don't involve 1,000 decisions, right? It's one decision where AIs and robots and computers can be incredibly helpful. So I think we'll work alongside them. But I think there's some things that we're always going to do better for a long time, and there are things that they're going to do better.
Do you think that with AI, it's always going to be a trust but verify sort of model? I mean, we at our institution, every image, whether it be a chest X-ray or a CT scan of the brain, is read now by an AI platform first. And then a radiologist will look at it as well. And what has struck me, Ted, is that sometimes they do a great job, the platforms, but sometimes they get a wildly wrong answer, not seeing an obvious lung cancer or something like that.
Right.
And it's bizarre to me, to be honest. And people forget that AI is not a supercomputer. What it's trying to do is replicate human consciousness. So it can be as fallible as a human can be. It's not like if you look up the War of 1812, then you go to another computer and look up the War of 1812. You believe what the computer tells you. But with AI, you can't always believe it because sometimes it can err so wildly. How do you deal with that? And
Well, I have two thoughts. I don't think an AI is trying to be a human consciousness. I don't think it ever will. I think a machine robotic consciousness will be completely different than anything we can ever imagine. But I think what will eventually happen is we're going to figure out what the error rate of that AI is, right? It's going to have a certain error rate. But human beings are going to have a certain error rate too, right? And so at some point, the AI error rate is going to be much, whether it's better or lower, it's going to be much better than the human. And at that point, it's going to be trust the AI, more so than the human. But until
and how long would you think before we're at that point?
Oh, I think it could happen in 2 or 3 years. I mean, I don't think that's going to take that long for certain tasks. It depends what the task is.
So reading images, maybe doing dermatological exams, looking at slides for pathology, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, but we have to have the experience of having both results next to each other and saying, who's making more mistakes, right? Let's figure it out.
And it'll be far more efficient if we get to that point. People could get lab results and tumor results, all that sort of stuff, much more quickly.
Yeah.
We got a lot of questions.
All right, let's do it.
A few minutes here, so I want to try and get to, okay. Why is the book called Gray Matters?
So that's a good question. So I didn't come up with the picture on the cover was not my idea, right? So that's the publisher. I love the picture, by the way.
That's supposed to be you?
It's not supposed to be me. It's not me. Gray Matters was actually a title that was come up by a friend of mine named Deb Kopaken, who's a very talented writer. So I give her credit for the Gray Matters title, and then the subtitle was actually Penguin Random House. But gray matter, so the part of the brain is made up of gray matter, which are the neurons, and white matter, which are the axons, the cables that connect the neurons together. So there is a part of the brain called gray matter. By saying gray matters, you're sort of saying that the gray matter matters.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. How do you balance being a great dad and a husband and a surgeon? And by the way, this came from Allie, your daughter, who's watching on live stream.
All right. Who goes to Michigan?
Who goes to Michigan?
You went
Go
to
Blues.
college, yeah. Well, Allie, you make it easy. I'll put it that way. I'm just very lucky and blessed to have an incredible wife and incredible kids who allow me to do what I do. never make me feel guilty for a second when I'm not around. I have brought every one of them into the operating room with me. They all come in because I wanted them to see what it is that I do when I'm not there. So when Dad can't come to something, it's not this mysterious thing that I was in the operating room, but they know what it is. And they also see, I've taken care of a lot of people in my community, like, friends of mine and family members, and they know, they get it. I mean, they're very smart, sophisticated, caring individuals, and they love it, actually. They love, if my phone goes off, they're like, go for it, Dad. Like, let's help this person.
Like I say, Allie's got it exactly right. I've gotten to know you. You are a great dad, a great surgeon, and a great human being.
You too. You have 3 beautiful daughters.
Yes, I do have 3 beautiful daughters. Thank you. By the way, one of them, my 15-year-old, has a concussion. And so I may as well take advantage of having you here.
Because you don't know anything about
concussions. I have
concussions.
my own thoughts on this, but they never like to listen to Dad. So I'm going to say I talked to Dr. Ted Schwartz about this.
And then she'll believe you.
And then she'll believe me.
Right.
But what, it's funny because there does seem to be this sort of nebulousness when it comes to treating concussions, especially in teenagers. Some people will say no screen time, all this sort of stuff. Don't do any homework on the screen, whatever it might be. Really limit activity. Other people say do what you can up until the point that you develop symptoms and then pull back. What are your thoughts on concussions? Well,
as you know, concussion can be so many different things, right? There are some children who are impaired by concussions for months and months and months, and there are others who can bounce back quickly. My son Benjamin is here, who had a very severe concussion playing hockey one day. He literally hit his head so hard that he did not know where he was, and then he didn't even remember going to hockey practice. And he went back into the house, and for a day or two, we kept him quiet. I let him go to sleep right away. I let him rest. But his headaches got better on day 2. And I said, all right, you should go back to school. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, all my friends get to stay home from school for like 2 weeks. Like, why are you sending me back? You're the worst dad ever.
He disagreed with Allie.
Yeah, he totally disagreed. Okay. And I was like, Ben, I want to reintroduce you as quickly as I can into regular life. And if you get a headache at school, sure, you can come home. But if you can tolerate it, you got to try to challenge your brain. And so I'm very much of the opinion that you should try to push to get back into what you're doing as quickly as you can, unless you have symptoms. Obviously, if you have symptoms, you take it back and you wait until you're symptom-free, and then you do a little bit more. So if it's for sports, you go to practice, and if you have no symptoms at practice, then you can play. But obviously, until that time, you take it step by step.
Rebounding from loss and mistakes takes strength. How do we teach youth to persevere rather, despite encountering setbacks? You have a routine?
Yeah, so I have 4 kids who all encounter setbacks constantly, and I'm going to tell a little story about the book. So I wrote the book that one year. I wrote the entire book, and that's not how you're supposed to sell a nonfiction book. That's not what real authors do. What real authors do is they have a writing sample, and they have an outline, and then they try to sell. They get an agent, and the agent sells it. So some of my friends who are writers said to me, you need to find an agent. And so I sent my book to 15 agents after I wrote it, and my whole family knew I was writing this book. My kids knew I was doing it. It was not a comfort zone for me. I was putting myself out there. And I got 14 rejections. And every time I got a rejection from an agent who said, it's not what we're looking for, we're not interested in help, I'm too busy, I can't do this, I would send a text to my whole family. And I would say, hey guys, just got rejected again. I just got rejected again. I just got rejected again. Because I wanted them to know that not everything was easy. And that even though you get rejected, you still keep trying. And I said, I'm going to send it to another one. I'm going to try again. I just got another rejection. And then it was, I got a yes. Chris Dahl, who's my agent at CAA, said yes to me. And one of her child had a concussion, which is what interested her in the project. But I try to share my failures with my kids so that they know that not everything is easy and that you need to persevere. And you're going to run into some tough times and some troubles. And you just have to keep doing what you're doing and believe in yourself. So I think the way you raise your kids is you share your own failures with them, and you embrace that. And it's not, how you fail, it's how you deal with failure and how you get up.
I remember I was interviewing some folks during the pandemic all about loneliness, and the psychologist made this comment to me that really stuck with me, that we want to have these close relationships with people, but how do you really define that? And people define that in different ways, but one of the ways that you define it is, can you be vulnerable around that person? And one of the ways to show vulnerability was to ask for help, actually ask somebody for help. I would have these conversations with my own parents, during the pandemic, and I didn't get to see them as much, and so we'd talk on the phone, and it would often be, how you doing? I'm doing fine. How you doing? I'm doing fine. It was these cursory conversations. And she said to me, the next time you talk to them, ask for help in some way. Don't burden them, but ask for help in some way. And my parents are both automotive engineers, as you know, and my wife had driven home, and there was some smoke coming out from underneath the hood of the car. And so I said, hey, while I got you, there's some smoke from the hood of the car. And they said, oh, put it on FaceTime, let us see. And they put on their reading glasses, and all of a sudden I was showing them the engine, and it wasn't even about the engine. It was about the vulnerability. And it really nurtured a conversation between me and my parents that otherwise would not be had. So in my case, it was me with my parents, you with your kids, but I think that vulnerability is really, really important.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sentiment. By the way, when I first heard that story, I thought your mother was a car mechanic. And then I realized that she was like a brilliant mathematician engineer and the first woman ever hired at Ford working for them, which is a remarkable accomplishment.
No, we're really, really, thank you for saying that. We're really proud of my mom. She is the first woman ever hired as an engineer in the Ford Motor Company, probably the auto industry. So. And she's an exacting woman who raised us really, really well. So we're very, very proud of her. What makes a good brain surgeon? This is from Richard Sloan.
Well, I think there's no one thing, and obviously human beings are very different, and there are many different types of people who can be good brain surgeons. But the ability to sacrifice, be willing to sacrifice, the ability to focus for long periods of time. I write a little bit about the book, this great moment where I talked to a professor who was a transplant surgeon when I was a med student. And I was really scared about giving up my life to become a neurosurgeon, all my other interests. And he said, you know what, Ted, if you want people to depend on you, you have to be dependable. So I think being dependable, right? So being a person who you're always there when they need you. Because if you're not there when they call, whether it's a referring doctor or a friend, they're going to call someone else, and then you're no longer the go-to guy. So if you want to be the go-to guy, you have to be willing to be the go-to guy, which takes which takes some sacrifice. So there's a lot of different qualities, but I think focus, sacrifice, being dependable, caring about other human beings, like deeply caring about other human beings is important.
And I think constantly keeping your skills up, constantly immersing yourself in the field as you do. One of the things you write about in the book is famous people, notable people who've either had brain surgery or had encounters with brain surgeons, including people like John McCain and Beau Biden and Ted Kennedy, who all had glioblastomas, Natasha Richardson, who had a epidural hematoma, several. Bob Saget you talked about, but you also talked about President Biden, who many of you may know, some of you may not know, but he actually had 2 brain operations.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk about that.
So, by the way, I was terrified that he was still going to be running for president when the book came out, because I talk about his brain surgeries, and I thought, oh my goodness, what if someone tries to latch onto this as some sort of ammunition against his candidacy? But so he had, when an aneurysm ruptures, and an aneurysm is basically an outpouching in a blood vessel in the brain, like a balloon.
He had 2 aneurysms.
He had 2. One of them actually leaked a little bit, and you can have what's called a sentinel bleed, where it bleeds a little bit, and you get essentially the worst headache you've ever had in your life. So it's not just an average headache, it's literally the worst headache you've ever had in your life, and it comes on all of a sudden. That is often an aneurysm that is bleeding a little bit, and that's a telltale sign that there may be an aneurysm that's about to rupture. Now, if an aneurysm actually ruptures, if you can imagine, 20% of the heart's force of blood goes to the brain, as opposed to the rest of your body, 20%. And all of that beating power basically is pushing blood now out through the wall of the blood vessel into the brain and onto the brain. And the pressure in your head goes up dramatically, very, very quickly. And it's an emergency. And roughly 50% of people who have an aneurysmal rupture will not survive their aneurysmal rupture. So he didn't have a rupture before his surgery, but he had a craniotomy where a surgeon opened up his head. And I tell the story of the surgeon, Neil Cassell, who is a very well-known vascular surgeon at UVA, who it turns out only has one eye. He was born with one eye. And he also never graduated from college, which was crazy when I read that. And then I actually had to interview him because I wanted to verify that that was the case. I was like, Neil, did you really not graduate from college? And it's true. He got to know the head of neurosurgery at UPenn. And he basically, the guy said to the head of the med school, like, he's got a spot in my residency program as long as you can get him through med school. And so they just basically pulled him out of college, put him into med school, and he graduated. So Biden had one aneurysm that was clipped, and it ruptured during the operation, and so Dr. Cassell was able to get control of it. And then he had another aneurysm, and often they come in 2s or 3s, that was clipped at a later time. So a lot has been made about the fact that he had these brain surgeries, and what does it mean that you have an aneurysm and that it leaks, and what does that do cognitively to you? Does it mean necessarily that you've lost IQ points? His aneurysm didn't rupture except under the operating microscope, so he really didn't have an aneurysmal rupture. And also the fact that he had brain surgery, what does that mean? Do you lose IQ points from that? And the truth is, there are people who can have aneurysms and make a full recovery, and there are people who have brain surgery, most people make a full recovery. So we really don't know the extent to which his aneurysmal rupture contributed to the fact that in the last debate, he clearly was not at his best. He probably was not great for the first 3 months to a year after his surgeries. I mean, I think that's probably true, that he wasn't at his best, but it's very well possible he made a full recovery.
These were over 40 years ago, right?
Yeah, long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing because we often think about patients who've had a rupture of an aneurysm. So again, if you think about the brain, it's inside the skull. And inside the skull, you have 3 things. You have brain, you have blood, and you have the fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. If you increase the amount of any of those things, there's not room for it necessarily because you're surrounded by skull. It's different than in other organs in your body, for example, in your belly. So someone has an aneurysmal rupture, even though it was during the operation. What would you have expected for someone like that?
Well, if it happens during the operation, right, their skull is already opened. So the pressure's not really going up in their brain. He had a bleed which put blood in the subarachnoid space, which is the area around the brain. But that in and of itself can get reabsorbed, right? So it doesn't mean that he necessarily had brain damage. And the surgery itself didn't necessarily damage his brain unless they were retracting on it. You know, so unless you've seen Biden's MRI scan, right, so we can see what his brain looks like, and unless you did neuropsychological testing on him before he had his aneurysmal rupture and after, we have no idea. He could be completely normal, or he could have lost a few IQ points. Very hard to know.
I just got to say, I think it's inspiring. This guy had operations on both sides of his head for aneurysms, and he became the president of the United States. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah,
really.
it is.
Here's another question. What is an exciting development for the future of neurosurgery? This is from Sabrina.
All right, Sabrina, maybe we should put up the third
Yeah, it's perfect.
slide.
Last slide.
Can we show the last slide? And it is 8:30, so if people, we can... And
Doctors are never on time.
Yeah. No. So brain-computer interfaces. So I want to talk just for a minute about that. And we hear a lot about it because of Elon Musk's Neuralink company. So brain-computer interfaces have been around since the 1960s. And I really write about the whole history of that. Most people only have heard about it now. But we now have the ability to implant electrodes in the brain and take information out of the brain and put it into a computer and translate from the brain's code to computer code. So if you have a patient who's quadriplegic and they're in a wheelchair and can't move their arms or their legs, we have the ability to have them just think about moving a computer cursor or tapping on a screen, or they can move a robotic arm or a robotic leg, or you can even take language out of the brain by having electrodes on the part of the brain that control how the mouth moves and the tongue moves. So they have to imagine themselves moving their mouth and tongue and speaking, and that information can be put into a computer, and you can literally have a virtual face talking while a person who can't speak in a wheelchair is thinking about talking, and all that information can be taken out of their brain. So the concept of telepathy or telekinesis or getting ideas out of our brain or moving objects at a distance just by thinking, all of those things we can do, and we've been able to do it for decades in research institutions. And Elon Musk has now developed the device, which is in the bottom left, that wirelessly does it. It gets implanted in the skull, and the electrodes that get implanted in the brain to take information out of the brain and put it into a computer. And there's some other examples of other devices. There are other companies that are now starting to compete with Elon's company because It's technology that exists. We already have the ability to do it. And it's really a remarkable future for us, because at some point when the surgery becomes safe enough, you could imagine taking a normal human being like you or me and putting something in our brains so that we can literally just think about controlling computers. And you think about anything that a computer can do, basically, which is essentially everything. You know, any task that goes on in your house is now under computer control, or driving a car or flying a plane. It's all mechanical. All of that information can come directly out of the brain, which can give human beings sort of unlimited potential to control the world around us.
So everything I think could actually...
It's not thinking at the moment. You have to be doing it. So it's not about thinking about a word. It's about thinking about saying the word, which I love, by the way. So there's a difference.
That kind of regulates you a little bit.
It regulates, because you worry about privacy issues, right? You don't want a device that can read your mind. And the device can't read your mind. So I can have all the private thoughts that I want, but I have to think about moving my lips to say that thing in order to get the information out. We don't know how thoughts are created in the brain. So the brain-computer interfaces don't take your thoughts. You have to, for example, think about writing something, and then the written word will come out. But you can't just think about the idea.
Last question. Do you believe we have free will?
I do not.
Really?
I don't.
I mean, I guess I'd expect that as a brain surgeon.
Well, so there's a lot of research that has been done, and I don't want to bore everybody, but when you, there are experiments that you can do on the human brain that brain surgeons have done, that neurosurgeons have done, because we have incredible access to the machinery of the mind, right? The brain is the machinery of the mind. And if you've done it long enough, and you've read the papers, and you've studied the experiments that have been done, you realize that the brain is essentially making decisions for us. And you can put electrodes in the brain that will record what you're about to do before you even know that you want to do it. And so those neurons will start to fire to move your hand, not because you've decided to move your hand, but they start to fire before you even made the decision to move your hand. And we know this because of experiments that have been done. It's not just a fantasy, it's true. We also know that we can implant information into the brain, and the brain can control your movement or control your feelings in ways that you're not aware of. And then when you behave that way, if someone asks you, why'd you just do that? You make up a story. And you say, oh, I did that because I was curious what was over there. So you can put an electrode in the brain that moves the head to the left. Every time you push a button, the head goes to the left. So this experiment was actually done. They pushed the button, the head turned to the left, and they said, well, why'd you just turn your head to the left? And he said, oh, I was looking for my slippers.
Interesting.
So the thought is that maybe everything that we do, the brain is making the decision for us, we're doing it. And then another part of your brain is just making up a story afterwards to make sense of why you did that thing and convincing you that you did it. And there's an incredible amount of evidence, and you can read the book if you want to learn more about it, little plug, to show why that is the case.
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying.
And we're going to have to leave it there. So, hey, how about a really warm round of applause for you?
Thank you. Thank you.
You got to read the book. I read the book. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.